Okay, so for you guys it may be a new day. For me it's a few hours after my last demo and I've had lunch and some coffee, and so I'm ready to go. So today we're going to talk about section views and what they are and how to draw them. So a section view is a vertical cut through your building, and its main purpose is to understand construction details and how parts of your building fit together. So the floor plan kind of shows how I would get from room to room and where kind of some major elements are located. The section view is incredibly important for building construction. And so we can tend to think of our building split into 4 main construction parts: our foundation, floor, walls, and roof. We can kind of put those into 4 main areas of the construction of the building. And the section views are critical in understanding how those connections can be made, because these are things that wouldn't be visible in our elevation plan. They aren't visible in our floor plan. We perhaps could put them in through hidden lines in an elevation, but then there's just going to be too much going on in that one view, and so this kind of helps opens that object up to see inside. There are, within section types, there's actually 2 different types of sections that we're going to look at. We're going to look at building sections or full sections and wall sections. And so they are defined by what they kind of sound like they are. The building section goes through the entire building. The wall section just looks at a typical wall or a specific area of just one wall of the building. But first off, for full sections, there's kind of 2 main ways we can define them. They could be called a transverse or cross section, which goes through the shorter of the 2 dimensions of the building, or kind of what I would define as the depth of a building, or a longitudinal section, which would go through the longer of the 2 overall dimensions. Now with our example from last class, we really don't necessarily have a longer of the 2 because it was just a 10 by 10 box. So in that case, I would probably just refer to it as a cross section no matter what, but that's not really something we need to dwell on too much. Another really important part of the full section is that there really aren't too many dimensions included in them. And that's because a lot of the dimensions that we could get from a section are available to us in the elevation. So I already have the top of the floor, the sill height of the window, the header height of the window, the top of the wall. Everything, all of that is already included in the elevation, and all of our wall locations from like side to side would also be included in the floor plan. So rarely do we have too many dimensions in our building section, but we do have a lot of different notes and leaders specifically referring to different materials. And so this is where those hatch patterns come into play a lot in the section views, because this is where we're seeing those connections, we're seeing what materials are used for in construction. Just here's another example of a full section of a building, or rather it's not completely full because we can see here that there's this break line, so this continues on even further. But we have a few hatch patterns to recognize different materials, so we can see concrete, we can see wood blocking or pieces of wood framing. So like this would be the bottom plate of a wall, this would be then the double top plate, these would be ceiling joists running across, as well as our rafters. And included along with the hatch patterns for the materials, we still have leaders identifying the material, some of it being identified in abbreviated short form. So we can see all the way in the bottom left. I won't try to move my mouse over there because then the little Google slide thing will just pop up and block it. But in the bottom left, we can see there our concrete footing, and then sitting on top of our footing is our foundation wall. On top of our foundation wall is our floor. On top of that are our walls, and then our roof system. And so we can see and understand a little bit more how the construction process is going in a section view. And then we can even have details of those particular connections. And in a typical wall section is where we would see all of the kind of smaller details and how the entire building comes together. So another full section, this is just kind of a more detailed one looking at just the roof. And we also have another example in this drawing here of what a break line looks like, which is just kind of this jagged line here. And so that's just symbolizing that these rafters go further down within this particular system. They're just not visible in the rest of this drawing. And a lot of times we use break lines so that way we can draw at a larger scale and still fit everything on the page. But we're seeing some of those hatch patterns included a lot more in our section views. We didn't really use any hatch patterns at all in our other ones aside from like our vertical siding. Now we're starting to be able to see the insulation that's going on within the roof system. We're seeing the sheathing. We're seeing the house wrap. We're seeing the shingles, all of that information that is included in our building sections and our wall sections. The reason why we don't put this kind of information in like our floor plan or our elevation views is because at the scale we're drawing them at, it's really not going to be beneficial to try to fit all of that stuff in there. It's not going to be visible. It's going to be hard to read. And so that's why we would want these kind of zoomed in drawings to help show us those pieces of information. One thing to kind of consider too is that section views are not something that are just standard for architecture. Section views exist in all forms of drafting, and so if we go towards engineering and kind of manufacturing, the section view is still a concept. And you want to think about how you orient your section cut and how you orient your section views in related to other drawings in the set. And so we have what we would call a typical drawing of a section. And so we'll see in a moment, after I do the first demo, we'll see in our next practice a typical wall section, which just says, this is it's going to look like typically around the entire building. You may also have detail of sections that will then refer to specific locations, and they would have that cutting plane and that reference. Building sections are also referring to specific locations, and so they have a cutting plane with a reference. And so here is just an example of a section view in a manufacturing plan where we have that cutting plane going through with our little view identifier saying which part it's facing towards. And so here it is three-dimensionally. We're cutting the part open and we're looking at just this area, and then it's what are we able to see if this half of the object, or in some cases that half of the building, has been removed. In very, very, very similar concepts in manufacturing to architecture. And so I just kind of wanted to make that a little bit known, because I know some of you guys, particularly the sustainable tech majors, may not really be going into a construction related field, but section views would still be something that you are going to be playing around with a little bit in drawings you may have to read. And so we're going to do a little practice. It's once again, I'm going to probably recommend that maybe you watch me go through the practice the whole way through, and then while you complete yours, you can rewind back to the beginning and follow along with me as I go. So this way you can kind of understand how I'm going through it the first time around without just pausing, starting. Because what I've noticed is when students do that, they've just put lines down, but they don't really know why or they're putting lines down. But ultimately, you can do whatever you want. I'm not there with you. I digress. So we are going to create a building section of the structure that we made from last class's practice, so hopefully you didn't throw it away. We're going to scale it at half of an inch equals a foot, so the same scale we did the floor plan and elevation at. Our section cut, so our cutting plane is going to run east to west, and it's going to face north, and we're going to take it 3 feet in from the north wall. Included also is some information about our foundation and footing, because that's going to be visible in our section view. And so we're going to have an 8-inch wide foundation wall. And keep in mind our walls are 6 inches wide, so our foundation wall is a little bit thicker. And is going to run 3 feet below our grade line. And our footing is going to be 2 feet wide and 1 foot deep. And so, let's now put that into practice. So, I have here my foundation. Whoops. Oh wait, no, I did switch it over to the webcam. I just can't see my webcam. Let me move it. Okay. So, I have here my floor plan and elevation from our last class practice. Now, in a fair amount of scenarios, and this will be one of those scenarios, you can borrow heavily from the elevation view to make a section view. Since we just have this slope running all the way through the building and there's no real variation to it, it's just a plain gabled slope, I could just put my tracing paper over my elevation and borrow a lot of the dimensions and line work to get it done. And in our big project that I keep hinting at for next week, I will show how I do tend to just use my other plans to help borrow dimensions rather than measure them out again. But for this one, I won't. I'll lay it all out from scratch. And you know what, I'm going to get a different pencil because that guy's getting a little too tiny for me. So our section view, and I have one laid out here. I don't know if I measured, honestly, to be exactly 3 feet. Let's see. I was so close. So really, my section cut should be taken from about here. I'm about 6 inches off. I was just kind of hand winging it, but that's okay. So 3 feet from my north wall is where that cutting plane is going to go through. I'm going to keep my cutting plane right there on my floor plan purely because it doesn't matter if I cut from there or there. I'm going to see the exact same thing. In the section, a lot of times we'll see in our building section, it goes directly through openings. So that way we can understand a little bit more about how that connection of like the sill plate and the top plate, the sill plate and the header are being made in the wall. But for this hand drawing one, for this one, we're not going to have it go through an opening. So it's just going to go through that wall. I have my little section view identifiers here and here. I don't have, necessarily a number and a sheet number listed on them because I don't know yet what the sheet number is going to be, what the view number is going to be. And so I just kind of have them as blank openings. I'm not going to put any view identifiers on any of these practices, so I'm just going to leave them as blank. But that arrow pointing towards this way means that my building is getting cut open, and then I'm going to be looking at that opening of the building, and this whole part of my drawing is going to be gone. It's not going to be visible at all. And so I'm going to be taking this drawing down quite a bit and referencing it as I go. So first step, of course, would be especially if you don't have any tools, would be to tape down a sheet of graph paper and then to take your tracing paper and tape over that. since I do have tools, I'm just going to have that graph paper there as kind of a little reference for those of you who don't have graph paper. I'm going to move my drawing up a little bit and just tilt it because it seems a little... Oh, but now that's skew. That's going to just bug the bejesus out of me. Hold on, guys. If that isn't straight on the camera, I'm going to just not have a good time. And every time I look up, I'm going to see it not straight. And I'm just going to have a small conniption, so bear with me. And I'm just going to tape my paper down. Okay, that's straight enough. It's still not perfect over here, but you know what? It'll be okay. I just won't look up at it too much. And for those of you who it's bugging, I'm sorry. And so this paper too is, as I mentioned in that first kind of class introduction, this isn't tracing paper like your roll of tracing paper. This is vellum, so it's more of like a plasticky feel. I just like it because it erases a little bit better. Which, speaking of that, where's my eraser? But your tracing paper will work just fine. Here we go. So, my first step, just like my first step with my orthographics, just like my first step with my floor plan, and let me just get some cleaner and clean my T-square. So one thing, if you're using like a T-square or some type of plastic straight edge, you might notice that gunk gets stuck to like the bottom and then it starts smudging everything. So it's not bad practice to clean it every once in a while so that way it doesn't smudge. But I'm getting off topic again. Maybe I had too much caffeine. Okay. So my first step, like every drawing, is to pick a starting point and draw a guideline out and a guideline up. Let's just dim that a little bit so you can see my guideline a little better. And a guideline straight up. Well, that's certainly not better. Ugh. You know what? I'll just draw darker, I guess. Okay, there we go. So I'll just draw darker and it's easier to see. And so that'll just be kind of the starting point. And when I do a full building section, I work as similar to the same way that I would do an elevation view. So I'm going to get my architect scale, and I'm going to use the 1/2 inch equals a foot scale. And I'm just going to measure 10 feet across. Make a little notation. And draw a guide straight up. And if you're using a 1/4 inch graph paper, then you can just use the graph as your 10-foot mark. So now I can either measure down for my floor or measure up. Since these are just guides, I didn't establish any particular height. I'm going to measure, that's my 1 inch, not my 1/2 inch. I'm going to measure up for my floor just because that's what I want to do. So I'm just going to measure 6 inches up. And a guide across. And then I'm going to measure up for the height of my walls, which we established was 10 feet above the top of the floor. So 10 feet above where I made that initial measurement, or 10 feet above where I established my floor height was, I'm going to go up. I am carrying these guides rather far, but that's okay because this is just my initial layout. And as I mentioned in the last couple of demos, typically if I'm doing a set of plans by hand, I lay everything out and then I take another sheet of tracing paper and I trace over that to be my final pretty plans. So any guide work I'd put down here, I wouldn't even really bother erasing for it. So now I have just the basic elevation laid out just like I had on here. Exact same measurements, which is why I could just kind of trace over this if I wanted to. And I'm going to measure out for my roof. And for my roof, I'll show you the little kind of offset trick that I had mentioned last time. And so my roof is 1 foot in thickness for my roof rafters. And so I'm just going to make little marks there for 1 feet. And I'm just going to make them a little bit bigger so that way they're easier for me to reference. Extend the guide up on both sides. And then using, where'd my half side go? Here it is. I'm going to measure up 3 feet from my initial roof line, draw a guide all the way across, and then I'm going to measure 12 feet in each direction. So 12 foot to that direction, and then from this side, 12 foot over. And so what that does, it allows me to just kind of connect the dots. And I'm not even going to bring that line all the way across, just because I know I would have to erase it if I brought it all the way across. So I'm just going to line up the 2 points I want to connect, and then just bring it as far as I need to. Now, for my top one, rather than measuring then 3 feet up from here and measuring to connect my points, I'm just going to go from where that roof ridge, that highest point is, and I'm just going to draw a line straight up, measure it to be 1 foot, and since I have the 1 foot up here, the 1 foot up here, and I have that point there, I kind of can just quickly reference my points. And I'll just get rid of these guides for my pitch. And so that's one way I could do like a gable style pitch a little bit faster. My little clicky eraser, I have no idea where I left it in between last lecture and this one, but that's okay. Oh, never mind, just found it. So next is I have something that looks very similar to the elevation that I made last time, but now I'm going to add in the details of my foundation. And so my foundation, if this right here is my ground line, I'm just not going to darken it yet because some of it may be getting erased in a moment. But if this is my grade line, my ground, typically we usually have around 6 inches of our foundation kind of peeking up out of the grade line, but we're going to ignore that rule for now. We're going to pretend that doesn't typically happen. And my foundation wall rests 3 feet underneath that. So I'm going to measure down 3 feet, make a little mark, draw a line across, which I did not do that dark enough because you cannot see that. There we go. And I'll just extend my guides down to meet it. And then I have a 1 foot thick footing. And so I'll use my 1/2 inch equals a foot. And I'm just going to measure 1 foot down and guide across. So this then is just kind of measuring out all of the notable different heights or elevations of my building. I have my footing, my foundation wall, my floor, my walls, my roof. So next, I will start to add in the thickness of my walls and other materials. Because since this is cutting my building open, and so here's like a little 3D model of a section view. Since I'm cutting my building open, I am able to see this floor and its thickness. So in a section view, this actually isn't going to be a hidden line. I'm going to be able to see these two parts of it. The same thing then with my foundation wall. I'm going to be able to see the thickness of it. I'm going to be able to see the thickness of my exterior walls as well. And so for my exterior walls, I'll measure 6 inches in on both sides. And I'm going to have to spin my scale around. And I'm just going to draw a guide up. Another guide up. And for my foundation walls, I'm sitting at about 8 inches. And so from that outside, I'm going to go in 8 and in 8. And so again, if you don't have a T-square and a triangle, if you measure 8 in on the bottom and 8 in on the top, you then can make your line go straight. Because if you're using 1/4 inch graph paper, well then just every box on your graph is 1/2 inch or 1/2 foot, excuse me. And so you then can just use the boxes to help with a lot of the measurements. That's why I kind of picked these general whole numbers. But for the foundation wall, we need to get a little bit more creative. Now for the footing that the foundation wall sits on, your footing is centered underneath the foundation wall itself. So what we need to define is where the center of that is. And so that's going to be at 4 inches. And so if this is 3, got 4 right there. And four. And so that's just giving me a nice little reference mark to measure out my foundation footing, which the instruction said was 2 feet. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to line up my 1 foot mark on this scale with the center, and then I'm just going to measure 1 foot in one direction, 1 foot in the other direction. And I'll do the same thing over here, but I'm going to have to flip my scale around because otherwise I hit my little bench. I'll go from the center, 1 foot, 1 foot. And now this guide I'm not going to bring all the way up like I've been doing with all of my other guides, because this is really only referring to my footing, and so it's not really going to have any bearing on the rest of this. Now I can start to kind of darken in some areas. We weren't given any information about necessarily the ceiling height. So there's two ways we can infer this ceiling. Is we can infer that there is a ceiling joist going all the way across, or that this has an open vaulted ceiling. I'm going to say that it has a ceiling going all the way across. And so let's say then that my ceiling joist is just made out of 2x4s, which in reality would be 1.5 inches, or rather 3.5 inches, but I'm just going to make them 3. And so I've got just like a ceiling joist going all the way across there. And so my rafters, I'm going to get my erasing shield out just so I can kind of get in that tiny little crevice to get rid of that part of the rafter. See, it has its uses. Doesn't have many uses, but the erasing shield's got its uses. So I can just get into some tiny little cracks. And I can continue to get rid of some of my guides. So I can get rid of my guides here. That helps me lay that out. I'm actually going to keep this one because that is my grade line. So I'm going to want that going across my whole building. And I'm going to keep this part of my footing as well, and that's just going to help us define some things related to line weights with this practice. So, do I want to lay out the window first? No, I'm going to do the whole X outside first, and then I'll put the window in. So typically we want the very outside edge of our whole section view to be a fairly thick line. The grade line should still be the thickest on the page, but we just kind of want that general outline to be the thickest one. Now, the interesting thing that the footing poses is that a foundation footing, you hopefully remember from 1708, or if you're currently enrolled in 1708, you hopefully have either learned about or are learning about very soon, is the footing is going to run across the entire perimeter of your building. And so the reason why I want to keep it as solid lines going across that bottom part is because while my section cut is going directly through it in these two areas, there's still that other part of the footing back there in my section. So that's why I don't get rid of the lines entirely. I just have them there, and they're just not going to be darkened like the other ones would. And so I have the general outline. I don't want to untape it. I just want to put like a normal piece of paper under it so we can see it without a graph. And so I have a general outline of my building section created. I still have some guides I need to get rid of. Some of my guides may not go without a fight just because I had to draw them pretty hard to get them to stick up on the page, but that's okay. Because as I said before, and even before that, and even before I ever mentioned it to you guys, I had said it before too, is that this right here would not be my final version. I would take a piece of tracing paper and I would trace over it to make my final version. So I've got my layout of my building done. I can see my wall thickness. Now what I need to do is, if I'm looking at the inside of this building and I'm looking at that wall, I need to include that window. Because if I'm standing inside this building cut open, I can see that window. So just like with our elevation view, I'm going to measure from the outside in 5 feet, because that's where the center of it is. Or I could have also just borrowed where those two lines meet for the ridge. And I'll put a guideline straight up. Let me remember to make it darker so it can show up on the camera. And then I'm going to take a measurement. Let me line it up. Whoops. I'm going to line it up with the 7 feet at the top of the floor. And then I'm just going to take 1 notch for the header. And then I'm going to measure 5 feet down from there. And 1 notch for the sill. So that way I can just kind of get those 2 measurements out at once. And this also could then be used if I was making this cut through a window. I could use it then to show where the window is placed in this wall with just doing less measurements. And then I'll line it up on 1 foot and I'll measure to 6 inches, so that way it's 1 foot 6 in this direction. And while I'm here, I'll even put my frame in. I'll even do my 3 inches for my frame. And then I'll measure it out at 6 inches. And I'll go 1 foot out in that direction, so I'm 1 foot 6 out. Just because I didn't want to have to do the math, I'll measure my 3 inches for the frame this time. I'll measure my 3 inches for the frame and my 3 inches for the frame. And so a lot of drafting is just making little tick marks and then making little lines. And so now I have my window framed out. I would want this to be not as dark or as thick of a line weight as my walls and like my roof, purely because this is behind where my section cut is. So all of this stuff that I went and darkened really deep is directly on the cut line. This window is behind it or beyond it. So I can still see the window, but it's not being cut through, so I don't want it to be as dark of a line. When we get on the computer, we define that with something called layers. In this, it's just kind of, how hard you press with your pencil. Now, in a typical full section, we also don't put too many construction details. Actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me finish doing my window first. And so in this case, since I'm looking at it from the inside, because I had it hinged on that side, now I'm looking at it from the inside, so it would be hinged on this side. Guideline out. Guideline out. And if you don't have an eraser shield, like I said, you can just take the eraser on your pencil and you can just make a hidden line yourself. I don't have an eraser on my pencil because I use the erasers up way too much. But this is essentially the same thing, or the same size. As what would be sitting on the head of your pencil, and so you can just dash it into a hidden line yourself. You don't necessarily need the fancy thing. Just makes it a lot easier, in my opinion. But because full section cuts are typically done at the same size that our building itself is at, and our building is typically done at 1/4 of an inch equals a foot, we don't put in all of the different construction details like the block, like our bottom plate or our double top plate. We wouldn't have, you know, like our ridge board and our ceiling joist going across. We're not going to put like our rim joist and our floor. All of that stuff wouldn't get included in a full building section. That would be reserved for the typical wall section. And I'm just going to really heavily darken, and I'm even going to move my straight edge down just slightly so that way I can really thicken this line up for my ground line, so that way we can show that that's the ground and it's really thick. I may have, or in my section I would have also the different materials in the building section. So I would have, you know, like hatching for my foundation, hatching for my foundation wall, my footing, my foundation wall. However, I didn't give any specifics about what these materials are. Even though this is most likely cast in place concrete, this is most likely the CMUs. Don't know why I'm losing all my words. We just wouldn't, we're not going to put them in here for this example because we're doing all right without it. And so what I'm doing now is just putting out for my spot elevations again. And so I still would have my spot elevations included in the section view. And then I'll use a little circle template, kind of whatever you have around is what you'll use. Oops, I'm stuck on my tape. Really, I should make that one a little bit further over. So it's always a good idea that you want them all nice and aligned with each other. It just helps make the drawing a little bit easier to understand and comprehend. And the same thing we'll see in just a moment with our wall section example is that all of the leaders and all of the notes have the same, are aligned with each other and have the same kind of starting points. And then I'll just use a nice vertical line to split them into quarters. They may not be perfectly split, but it's okay. Because it's just a practice. And so, as I had mentioned, we'll have our top of floor, which sits at a height of 0, 0. And then once we start doing like our foundation, so this would be the top of footing. And this would be at -3 feet. Because in this particular instance, if this is 0, actually it would be -3 feet, 6 inches. Because then we have the top of our foundation wall, which is 6 inches underneath that, and then our foundation wall, which is 3 feet. So our heights are now going into negatives, which is fine. It's just we need to make sure that we put that negative number. Then we have the top of sill, or rather the bottom of sill. I'm getting goofy, which is at 2 feet. Our bottom of header, which is at 7 feet. And then our top of our ceiling, which we have at 10 feet. And remember, you always want to make sure that you put those inches in there too, just to help make sure that there's no confusion about the measurement. If there's 0 inches, you still just put 0 inches. And so that is a little brief introduction to section views. We're going to play around a little bit more with section views throughout this class. We have a whole AutoCAD day dedicated to section views. Sections in Revit are some of my favorite stuff to put together, purely because Revit does a lot of this work, a lot of this measurement work for you. You just tell it where you want the cut to be, and it'll make all of those measurements for you automatically, which it's pretty great. Some people they're kind of upset about that because they're like, oh, well then you're not really thinking about the relationship between everything. And it's like, yeah, but I think you're just jealous that you can do that. So speaking of wall sections, our wall section then is where we have lots of that nitty-gritty information about those connections, about the materials, and there are a lot of leaders and hatches included in these types of views. Wall sections are almost always done as just what's called a typical one, and so that means that this window is not running through the entire wall. This is just in one particular instance. This is how most of the windows are getting connected. So there is not necessarily something saying that all of the windows have to have this sill height here. It's just saying that, hey, if there's a window in this building, this is how it's getting connected into the wall. This is what the headers are typically looking like. This is how our floor is getting anchored into our foundation. This is how our footing is connected to our foundation wall. So you'll see all of the different pieces of information about foundation wall thickness, the height of the foundation wall, the material used in that, as well as the material used in the framing, in the floor, in the wall, ceiling, everything. What material is covering the wall? How is the ceiling getting constructed? What is the roof framing material and slope looking like? What is the waterproofing system going on in here? And so this is where you're getting lots and lots of information in the form of both hatch patterns and those leader notes. And so looking at this one, and I'm pretty sure on the next slide I put just a zoomed in version of it. Whoops. Yes, I did. Good. So I can see here just from hatches in general, what I can understand is that this is cast in place concrete. So is this. So is here. There's rigid insulation sitting underneath it. And then it's the compacted earth. I've got some gravel going around a drain for my foundation. I can see that there's batt insulation going through the walls. I can see that there's shingles sitting on the outside. There's more rigid insulation up here. And so within those hatch patterns, just as you get more familiar with the patterns and what they mean, you can get that kind of immediate shorthand, and then the leaders are there to imply the very specific notes about all of the exact materials and concepts that are included in the construction. So in this particular one, all of the leaders are aligned the way that they should be, in that all of the text starts in the same place. These arrowheads kind of go at depending on how long each line is, but all of the text is still aligned with each other. And the other thing you'll notice is even in the larger version, none of these arrowheads ever overlap each other. And that's because the moment they overlap each other, I don't know which one is referring to what. And so we always want to make sure that we have them kind of lined up so that whichever one is above it is not overlapping any of the lines or the leaders below it. And so I know it's a little bit blurry on this one just because I just zoomed in on it, but we can then see this is that same wall section from the last side, but just zoomed in towards the foundation. So we can see then that the footing is an 8-inch by 16-inch footing. We can see that this is a 4-inch drain wrapped with 12 inches of gravel around it, and that there's a fabric filter. Sitting inside our footing wall is our, is referring to this rebar sitting inside our footing. And then in our foundation wall, we have number 4 rebar. We have our, how big is that key that helps put the foundation wall into the footing. We can see every single little bit and piece of material identified and defined in the wall section. And the wall section is typically done at a much larger scale than the rest of your drawings. So if we have our floor plans and elevations done at 1/4 inch equals a foot, our wall section will be at either 1 inch equals a foot or 3/4 of an inch equals a foot. And there may even be detailed call-outs of specific areas that would be done at an even larger, like a 1.5. Or you can even have details done at 3 inches is equal to a foot. Just to make sure that all of those construction concepts are covered. So for this practice, this one isn't going to involve creating any drawings, but in the assignment file that is in the description, there's a link to it in the description below, or you can go on the assignment page on As You Learn. There is a wall section with just some little blank boxes or text boxes, and we'll just follow along as I go through and walk through and label some of the parts, which I felt it might be a little easier for than me trying to do a text box thing is if I just printed it out. So here we go. So here is a typical wall section. It's not done or printed at any particular scale on As You Learn, but we have our footing, our foundation wall, our floor, our wall system, and then our roof system. And a lot of the different details of the leaders have been removed, and we're just going to kind of go over what some of the construction concepts that are covered here are. So the other thing you'll notice too is that the leaders here are organized a little bit differently, but it's still an acceptable way to do it, where the words necessarily aren't always going to reach the exact same endpoint once we have them all typed in there, but the leader lines all end at the exact same place. I just drew on that with the coloring of this pencil. So that's one way. That's another way you can organize your leaders. It's still a totally acceptable way. This is the way that I would tend to do it rather than what that other example showed. But you know, that's where your creative freedom can really run wild. So we can start at the bottom. So this right here, this is pointing to earth, or just the dirt around our building. And I can tell based on its hatch pattern that that's what it is. And then sitting right at the very bottom of our building is our footing. And so our footing just helps distribute the loads of the entire building into the ground. Now, running around the perimeter of our building is our French drain, which just helps kind of collect water and keep it away from the concrete in our foundation. Concrete sucks up water very well, and the issue then is if it freezes, it will expand in that concrete and it'll crack. And that's also why, and we'll go over this on the day of foundations, but it's also why we always make sure our foundation and our footing sits below the below where the ground freezes, the frost line. I couldn't think of the word for a hot second. And we also have our foundation here. I can see in some of the hatches that it's being surrounded with rigid insulation, but the French drain just kind of helps make sure that we're not getting anything in there that we don't want. Next then, helping connect our foundation to our footing is some rebar. And that just kind of helps these CMUs here that are making up our foundation wall. It's helping them just stay sturdy, as well as then connect them to the footing themselves, which means this right here is pointing to a CMU, or a concrete masonry unit. Then connecting our foundation to the floor is a horizontal member that we refer to as the mud sill, which is just a piece of dimensional lumber that helps connect the foundation to the floor. And there's usually like a little anchor bolt in there to help make sure that the two of them are secured to each other. Now our floor is made up of, and I should have erased this arrow here, so ignore that arrow, but our floor is made up of floor joists. And so the floor joists are just the members running across the floor to help span it all. We have also here, based on this hatch pattern, I can see that there is batt insulation in between all of the floor joists, and that's just to kind of help make sure that we have less airflow coming out from underneath here. Particularly in the winter, the cold air will heat up once it comes into the foundation, and it'll rise, and then it'll push all of our hot air out of the top, which we generally don't want to happen. Now our wall is sitting on top of our bottom plate. And I do have an entire day, again, dedicated to just kind of framing and construction concepts. But I'm hoping that some of this is at least a refresher from 1708. And then what is pointing out to here are just our plain old wall studs. And so the studs are the vertical members going across that our walls are framed out of. And wall studs really can't be seen in a section view necessarily, but this is what from right here to here is kind of inferring, is that we have wall studs going across this frame. This portion right here is our window pane. And so in this particular drawing, we just have a fixed window. So this window doesn't open or close or anything. It's just a sheet of glass, or rather 2 sheets of glass inside here. This then is our trim on the outside and inside of our window. And then these lines here are just representing kind of the rest of the window frame that are behind the cut of where this is being taken from. Then we have right here, so this part of our wall section is the header of the window and how it gets framed out. Then we have our roof rafters. Right here, this is just a gutter. And then all the way on the top, we have whatever our roofing material is, whether it be shingles or, in this case, it's metal decking. But whatever our roof material may be is sitting right at the top. And we can even see in the picture too, there's some little dash lines or hidden lines, and that's just representing our house wrap going around. We can see it going all the way down here, all the way down here. We can see our flashing coming out a little bit. So we have everything to try to keep our building nice and tight, because as we go over some of the construction concepts in that upcoming lecture, we need to make sure that we're keeping our building as tight as possible, because otherwise we're losing the air that we've conditioned and paid money to condition and wasted energy to condition. And so we want to keep our building as tight as possible. And I promise one day there'll be a lecture day where I don't just say, but we'll do that in another day. Because soon all of those days will pass. Okay. Now, you can have sections in plan view, so you can have sections from above. So here's an example of a fireplace in section. So we're looking at it from above, but if we had cut it open, so this way we can kind of see where different pieces of masonry are going, where are making sure our wood framing is nowhere near our fireplace. You'll have sections in plan for areas that stray from maybe typical construction details. So if it's a very specific abnormal feature that wouldn't be done the way that it would either typically be done, or maybe it's something that most contractors wouldn't be doing on an average or daily basis. If it's a staircase that maybe has some specific feature to it that's important, you could do a section in a plan view. And aside from necessarily sections with details, you can also have large scale details for things like elevations. So large scale details don't need that interior construction that section views give us, where they show us what all of the insides of the building look like. We'll see a lot of large scale details for cabinets and for bathrooms. Staircases tend to have large scale details to them. I don't need to necessarily see that internal structure of this set of cabinets, but I do need to know the general sizes of it and where the different parts or pieces are going. And so this is then where you would use some of those larger scales on your architect scale, like the 1.5 inch equals a foot or larger. Many of these details are best shown by combining in interior elevations with plan views, and sometimes even in isometric, particularly with stairs or other installation details. Having that three-dimensional view, it can be very helpful to understand how the concepts of those elevations tie into each other. Now here's that kind of same fireplace from that previous section in plan. So here then is an enlarged detail of it drawn in elevation. as well as then an enlarged detail of it in section. And so this right here is the exact same, and I should have moved the picture down a little bit, but it's the same then as this right here. Those are the same pieces of mantle. But this is then looking at it from the side if we had cut it open, and it helps then kind of understand what exactly is the back part made out of, how is it getting not exhausted, but, well, how is it getting out of the house? How is everything framed around it? And so just the elevation isn't going to be enough for the details related to this fireplace, but then it combined with the section itself, how is it getting connected to the floor? All of those different pieces kind of come into play to help understand the full story. Another thing to consider with all of those section details, or just any detail in general, is they are going to be connected to the plan itself. And so here we have an elevation of a building, and we can see that there is this detail call out, or this section call out right here. So that's saying if you go to view 2 on page 7, you'll see the section view of how this skylight is installed. And then flash forward to over here, view 2 on page 7, we then can see that this is drawn at 3 inches equals a foot. So compared to the, once that thing goes away, but compared to the 1/4 inch equals a foot scale that the entire elevation is drawn at, we can see all of the different connection details related to that skylight. So we can see that this is the dome plastic of it. This looks like how we can potentially open the skylight up. And then we can see all of the intricate little details about how this is getting installed, where the flashing goes so that this way it's sealed off and no water can get in on that roof. How the roof itself is framed out for that connection, all of those details go into that. And so our section views, no matter what, are always going to have some reference included in the elevations and floor plans, as well as our details. They're going to have the view and sheet number referenced to them. Sometimes it may be in the form of a little dashed bubble going around an edge, like a little kind of rectangular bubble with filleted or curved corners, but it'll still then say what view and what sheet that would be located on. And so that was a kind of brief foray into section views. As I mentioned many a times, next week, let me check my plans too, because, okay, good. I was like, if we're not doing that next week, I'm going to feel real dumb. So next week, I will release your first major drawing assignment, and I then am going to do a kind of extended demo of how you would start that project, lay it out, and I'll get fairly far into it because I did this for the last class too, and I got, within the 2 hours, I definitely got everything laid out. I didn't get the whole project done, but the other thing to keep in mind is that I'm going to work probably a little faster than you, and that's okay. I should be working faster than you. And so you'll have about 3 weeks to complete that project outside of class time. And I would recommend following along with my demo, going back and pausing it. But we'll save that all for next week, I guess. And I will shut up for now. So thanks for watching. Thanks for keeping up with your work. And I will talk to you guys next week.